All right, welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the U.S. and around the world. This is a podcast to listen to with your fellow workers organizing on the shop floor. This is a podcast to listen to before walking into your union meetings. As always, I am Rick Urrutia here with my co-hosts Bryan and Gerry. In today's special edition of We Rise Fighting, the three of us honor Black History Month by presenting on our favorite, most inspiring and instructive moments or leaders from the history of the Black worker struggle in the U.S. Bryan chose to speak about Paul Robeson, Gerry will present on the food and tobacco workers as well as Moranda Smith, and I will talk about DRUM, the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement. We're going to get into all that. We're very excited about this show after we check out this song. This one is titled Please Mr. Foreman by John L. Carter.
Please, Mr. Foreman, slow down your assembly line. Mr. Foreman, slow down your assembly line. You know I don't mind working, Lord, but I do mind dying.
All right, welcome back, everyone, and we're very excited to bring you this episode. Tonight we reflect a little bit on Black history in the United States, and in doing so, we wanted to offer a really quick condensed version of Black history and labor in the U.S. I'm going to go ahead and start with the arrival of African people to be enslaved in plantations in the South, and the immeasurable surplus value they created, the economy they created, and of course the exploitations and brutality and barbarism that accompanies chattel slavery. Well, by the 1860s, slavery was abolished, and by the early 1900s, the industrialized North had gotten to a state where Henry Ford could come out and offer $5 a day for anyone to come in and work at his auto plant. And this helped create a flood of Black folks migrating from the South to the industrialized North in search of these jobs. Now, upon arriving, and this is why we like to highlight these things, and this is why we need to talk about Black history. But upon arriving in places like Michigan, they were met with segregated communities, and they were met with organizations like the KKK. And I have to put that out there because this is one of those instances where labor history teaches us something, right? Because just about 20 years ago, as for so many generations, we've had immigrants coming from Latin America migrating north towards the US. And who are they confronted with at the border? Well, vigilante groups and groups like the Minutemen. So there's parallels to be drawn and there's lessons to be learned from the struggle of Black workers in the United States. And to give you an idea of what those numbers actually look like, in 1910 in Detroit, there were approximately 6,000 Black people in Detroit in 1910. By 1920, that number had grown almost sevenfold to 41,000. And in 1930, it was 120,000, and then growing by no less than 100,000 people every 10 years until 1970. All right. So that's the basic history of the great migrations that took place from the South to the North. Now, as far as unions are concerned, the first union that really opened its doors to Black workers and other workers, minus Chinese workers, was the Knights of Labor. And they were very radical for their time for doing that. And again, to offer a condensed version of this history, the Knights of Labor, a lot of its leadership evolved and became part of the leadership of the industrial workers of the world, an anarcho-syndicalist union, which also accepted Black workers into its ranks, as well as any worker, quite frankly, including Chinese workers. And then further on with labor history a little more, the CIO was the next big group within labor to very openly, open its doors to Black labor, because the history of this had been started largely by craft unions and AFL unions, which only opened its doors to skilled white workers. So the fact that the Knights of Labor, the IWW, the CIO were opening its doors to Black workers, at a time of Jim Crow segregation, blatant and overt racism. I mean, those were radical acts. So those unions need to be highlighted, and also the participation of Black workers in those unions needs to be highlighted, recognized, because there's lessons to be drawn from all of that. All right. Now, speaking to the industrialized unions that organized Black workers, one of them was the United Auto Workers. And, the United Auto Workers has a really interesting history as far as civil rights. It definitely got behind some of the civil rights causes and Black worker struggles, but at the same time, it suffered from some of its own contradictions as far as representing Black workers. So in my portion of tonight's episode, I'm going to focus on one of my favorite bits of U.S. labor history, and that would be the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement that took place in Hamtramck and Detroit, Michigan. And the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement was a movement of Black workers within the UAW. And in preparation for my presentation, I went through some old books and highlights to refresh my memory on some of the historical details. And one of the main books I referenced is called Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, which I highly recommend. It's a book written by Dan Georgiakis and Marvin Serkin. And the book starts the story of the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement in Detroit in the summer of 1967, shortly after the Great Rebellion in Detroit. And shortly after the Great Rebellion, H. Rap Brown came to speak and delivered one of his usual fiery speeches at a rally of about 5,000 people. And it was the organizers of his appearance, it was the organizers of this event who began making moves to publish a community newspaper called the Inner City Voice. Now, these organizers included people who had been members of organizations like Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the New Freedom Party, Uhuru, and the Revolutionary Action Movement. And the book describes the Inner City Voice, again, this community newspaper created by these activists, as many things. It describes a newspaper as a voice of the working class, a voice of working students. It covered the living and working conditions of the Detroit working class. Its editors wanted to present complicated revolutionary ideas in a popular and exciting format. And the unifying ingredient in all Inner City Voice material was the sharp emphasis on defining the strategy and tactics of the ongoing Black liberation struggle and how it might configure and trigger a second American Revolution. Its editor, John Watson, more than anyone else, was responsible for its characteristic ability to present complicated ideological analysis of capitalism in a popular style, which made the leap from theory to practice seem almost automatic. So basically, the paper was able to take quote unquote complicated. I don't like to use the word complicated too much because none of it is really complicated. Sometimes the reading can be a little difficult and demanding, but the ideas, the revolutionary ideas of, say, Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, they're not that complicated. The reading can be a little rigorous, but nevertheless, they would be able to take these ideas and popularize them and make them very exciting. The paper's consistent anti-capitalist analysis transformed articles about hospitals, police, and housing from simple expressions of grievances capable of reform to a critique of the entire social order. So Part of what I loved about going back through this history is stuff like that. They're applying the theory, and they're not, the newspaper wasn't just offering economic education. It wasn't just offering trade union education. In other words, it wasn't offering just education around money, bread and butter issues, health demands, and stuff like that. It was offering political education and larger theoretical political education. So it wasn't telling you, which Democrat to vote for in the legislature, how to maneuver Congress, how to maneuver City Hall. It was asking larger questions like, what is Congress? What is the state? What is the role of the working class versus a capitalist ruling class? So that type of political education. And that's one of the reasons that I love Drum and its leadership, is because they put this stuff out there. They tried to figure out ways to implement some of this revolutionary theory, some of this labor theory in the workplace. So that's part of the reason that Drum was so exciting. And its publishers were a core group of some 30 Black activists who had organized themselves into an informal study/action group. And most of their time was spent exploring exactly how revolutionary ideas might be implemented in their place of work. So they would read stuff like Marx, Lenin, Mao Zedong, and had a reading group of on Marx's Capital, which I think is really important, and I think also really threatening in the hands of Black workers in Detroit at that time, because just historically in Detroit, in auto worker jobs, Black workers had been offered the worst of the jobs, the most grueling, the most demanding of the jobs for the lowest pay, and using the lowest number of workers possible, really the most exploited. So for the inner city voice and the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement to start putting ideas out there like that and offering political education in Detroit, in auto workers, in auto work, in the belly of the beast. I mean, this is a big deal. They're talking about putting workers in control of production, and when you put ideas like this out, soon enough, the FBI started paying visits to the inner city voices printing companies to ask owners why they were supporting subversion. And the immediate result of this was that the printing companies would stop publishing the inner city voice. And, here, not to sidetrack so much, but an even more effective weapon against the inner city voice was the typographers union, which took the position that even if a printer was down to print the paper, the union would go on strike to prevent it. And, the book also states that John Watson recalls with bitterness that one of the officials of the union, of the typographers union, was a well-known member of the Communist Party. And when personally asked to use his influence within the union to be in solidarity with inner city voice, the official responded saying that there's nothing that could be done. So part of this history says that the inner city voice had to take its printing operation to Chicago and use the same printing company as the Nation of Islam, that the Nation of Islam used to print Muhammad Speaks at the time. So it's an interesting little bit of history there. But again, inner city voice kind of provided that springboard for Drum to happen. And what Drum did was in May 2nd of 1968, workers reached a boiling point as far as the level of exploitation at the Dodge main plant in Hamtramck, Michigan. And on that day, 4,000 workers walked off the job on a wildcat strike. And the driving force of the group of organizers would be the people who were involved with Inner City Voice. So people like General Baker, for instance, who had been on the shop floor talking about using militant tactics for a long time. And a lot of workers would just respond thinking, nah, man, that's a little too radical. And then when push came to shove and Dodge pushed the assembly line to go even faster, and the workers reached their breaking point, that's when, the ideas of General Baker and the study groups and inner city voice finally made sense, and 4,000 people walked off the job. Well, 4,000 people walked off the job in a wildcat strike. If you're unfamiliar with the term, a wildcat strike is a strike that's neither authorized by the union or the company. It's just the workers taking off on their own. And that's what happened on that day. Now, part of the success of Drum, a part of the success of that action and other actions to follow at Dodge, Maine by Drum was that it inspired other RUMs, other revolutionary union movements in other factories. This included UPRUM for UPS workers, HRUM for healthcare workers, NewRUM for Detroit newspaper workers, LRUM for Eldon Avenue Revolutionary Union Movement, FRUM for Ford workers, JRUM, MAYRUM, KDRUM for Cadillac workers, and many other drums. And so all these drums started popping up. And again, the leadership of Drum, the leadership of Inner City Voice, they needed to figure out what to do, where was this all going? And one of the experiments that they carried out was to create the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit to try to bring all these RUMs together. And it did so. Its leadership did come together. They formed an executive body. They put a lot of good ideas out there, but it seems at least from my readings, that some of these RUMs weren't active enough to keep things going. And had they been active enough to keep things going and involved enough to keep things going, the book theorizes that, it would be a political force to be reckoned with, if not offer itself as an alternative union altogether. So, those are some of the lessons to be learned. Like I just walk away inspired when I think about and go back and read about Drum, because of the level of experimentation that took place at the time, and also the context under which all this stuff happened, right? In the late 60s with the Black Radical movement, the Black Panthers, MLK was still alive when Drum formed. Malcolm X had been assassinated. There was all this social turmoil, and people were looking for direction. People were looking for answers. The Great Rebellion was, again, another response to police brutality and more oppressions from society. So there was all this social turbulence happening, and to see Drum, carrying out and experimenting with some political theory, some revolutionary labor theory in the workplace, this is a major threat. The last thing that I'm going to mention as a token to how much of a threat this was, the last thing I'm going to mention is that the New York Times was quick to get on reporting about Drum. This was critical. I mean, this was a no-no. You can't have, these revolutionary Black workers in industry in Detroit in the late 60s during the Vietnam War, talking about worker control of production and carrying out wildcat strikes. No, that's a no-no. Because as we've talked about in this podcast before, when one group of workers is successful and other workers see it, then they're emboldened, and they also want to carry out whatever actions the first workers carried out. And so that was part of the success of the RUMs, is that they started receiving calls and contacts from other civil rights and labor organizations around the country, just basically asking, hey, how do y'all do that? And can we connect? Can we collaborate? Can we work in coalition? And for that reason, and this is where my portion of the presentation ends, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers also evolved into the Black Workers Congress. And the Black Workers Congress, the point of that organization was to tie all these different organizations that were spread out across the nation and also the world. They were thinking on those terms of connecting organizations around the world under the umbrella of the Black Workers Congress. So I encourage anyone who's interested on this subject to read about drum, check out the book Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. Check out the documentary Finally Got the News on YouTube. It's available for free. It's a 1 hour documentary about the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. It's got original footage. It's a sight to see. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from drum, and a lot of inspiration to be gained. I mean, these were Black workers studying Marx, studying Lenin, studying labor theory, organizing wildcat strikes. So that's my contribution to tonight's discussion on Black labor history. That's what moves me, and that's what inspires me, and I hope others can take some time to also learn about drum. I'm going to pass it on now to Bryan, who's going to cover another little piece of Black labor history in the United States.
Hey, Rick, thanks for that tremendous history. It's very critical to read and study and apply that today to today's conditions. So thank you very much. To our listeners, we are going to just raise up in our view, one of the most important historical figures for a whole variety of reasons, some of which we'll mention over the last 100 years, and that is Mr. Paul Robeson. Before we go into a little history of Mr. Robeson, we would like to just raise up, of course, that there's been a long-standing, hundreds of years of history between Black and Indigenous solidarity. And so tomorrow on February 6th, there will be actions across what's known as Turtle Island, which is an Indigenous term for North America for actions for Leonard Peltier, who's been in prison for over 40 years, illegally and unjustly. He was framed up by the FBI, and Leonard Peltier is our brother. Here at We Rise Fighting, we demand his immediate release. And that is in the spirit of Mr. Robeson, who was involved in many actions like this, such as the Scottsboro Brothers, among many, many others. So for those of our listeners who aren't familiar, or maybe a little bit familiar with Mr. Robeson, he has decades of contributions as a scholar, athlete, theorist, linguist, actor, father, union supporter, and a socialist. And they're very vast and deep, his contributions. He was also a steadfast supporter of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the former USSR. We would encourage our readers for more history to read his own biography, which is entitled Here I Stand. And there's also a documentary as a complement to the book that Mr. Robeson wrote. It's our view that this book is critical to understanding his thoughts and his actions, and also the support he received from his spouse, Mrs. Eslanda Robeson, which Dr. Barbara Ransby wrote about in a biography about, and his brother also has written about Mr. Robeson extensively. There's so much to study about Mr. Robeson that we can just barely touch on that tonight, but we thought we'd raise a few of his most important contributions, but there's so many more. He of course had an internationalist worldview, which was similar to his co-thinker and friend and comrade, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. In particular, they always grounded their analysis in the over 250 years of legalized slavery in the U.S., as Rick mentioned. The forced extracted labor power of slaves by whipping, rapes, and other horrific acts by the slave owners and their compradors of those of African descent, and also indigenous and Mexicans and other oppressed nationalities, built the foundations of the modern U.S. So when Mr. Robeson spoke, he always grounded his analysis in that. Over 250 years of forced, free, extracted labor of Africans enslaved in the United States under the most horrific conditions built this country that we now know as the United States. Mr. Robeson and Dr. Du Bois, they consistently raised the role of African slaves as well in regard to resistance and rebellions at every single stage of the struggle, including from the time that they were snatched from Africa by Europeans and also those in the United States, slave owners, including during the Civil War, when, as Dr. Du Bois wrote in Black Reconstruction, slaves en masse went on a general strike, which eventually ended legalized slavery. Mr. Robeson's analysis also informed his view of the role of Black workers and Black churches as vanguard forces in the U.S., in particular, the building of multinational unions, with women as part of that. Mr. Robeson was fundamental in assisting in the building of the CIO unions, Congress of Industrial Organizations, in the 1930s and 40s, including in the auto, steel, packing house, and rubber industries, and many more. Historian Philip Foner has written extensively on this topic, as have historians such as Dr. Robin D.G. Kelly. And that there's much more information from those historians and many others on Mr. Robeson. For his unrelenting commitment to working class and oppressed peoples internationally, Mr. Robeson's refusal to condemn the USSR, his role assisting African independence movements, and to note that Mr. Robeson was also a linguist. Some say he knew 20 plus languages that he could speak fluently, many African. His connecting the Black freedom struggle and socialism, and his ability to reach hundreds of millions with his cultural contributions through his singing and other work as an actor as well. The bosses forced their political servants to seize illegally Mr. Robeson's passport in 1950. Mr. Robeson's passport was stolen for over 8 years, but he continued his critical work, specifically in assisting unions and other activities. And Foner goes into a lot of depth on that, on his work on Robeson. Some of Mr. Robeson's most important work was helping to build a variety of Black working class formations in alliance with workers, other nationalities and their unions, and community organizations. And he did this unrelentingly for decades. One example of this is the Food and Tobacco and Agricultural Workers, known by its acronym FTA, and supporting leaders such as Sister Moranda Smith. And Gerry will tell us something about the contributions of Sister Moranda Smith. Thanks, Gerry.
Thank you, Bryan. And it gives me great pleasure to give a short biography of my favorite figure in U.S. labor history, Moranda Smith, who was an organizer and elected union official of the same food and tobacco workers you were talking about just now. And so, why she's not on a postage stamp is an injustice, but maybe we can build a movement for that, or even make a holiday for her. But here's why. On a hot, dusty day in September 1949, 34-year-old Moranda Smith strode bravely down the main streets of Apopka, Florida. The local clan was after her, and she knew it. The night before, a group of Klansmen had kidnapped a Black man and tried to force him to reveal where she was staying. They threatened his life, forced his face down into the ground, but he would not reveal her whereabouts. They left his beaten body on the streets for all to see the next day as a warning. Because when Sister Smith, as she was known, learned of this, she marched alone through the city on the main street the very next day to show that she and her union, Food and Tobacco Workers, CIO, originally the United Cannery Workers Union, were not afraid. At the time, Moranda Smith was the Southern Regional Director of the Food and Tobacco Workers Union, a union with over 100,000 members and a powerhouse in the Jim Crow South. At the same time, this is 1949-1950, Moranda Smith was the highest elected African-American woman in organized labor and likely the highest elected woman in all of labor. Her union was led, like her, by a cadre of dedicated communists, Black and white, revolutionaries who, unafraid, took on the prevailing political power of the ruling white supremacist establishment in Tennessee, Florida, North Carolina, and other localities throughout the South. Sister Smith, as she was known, had been traveling throughout the region that month, visiting her many union locals, trying to defend the food and tobacco workers from raids and hostile takeovers by both the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, and the American Federation of Labor. Often traveling by bus and eating in segregated restaurants, she would find overnight accommodations in the homes of her rank and file, usually Black or white women. She was on a desperate mission to save her union, which would soon not have access anymore to the National Labor Relations Board, ballot procedures, or its legal protections. Because the Taft-Hartley Act had just recently passed in Congress, requiring union leaders like like her, signed a communist affidavit and swearing they were not members of the Communist Party in order to access the protections and rights originally guaranteed by the 1935 Wagner Act. Although the CIO had been the beacon of progressive labor in the civil rights movement since 1936 during the Popular Front era, but by 1946, it had new Cold War leadership led by longtime anti-communist Walter Reuther of the aforementioned United Auto Workers. The CIO soon began purging its own leadership by way of the loyalty oath in 1946, even before the Taft-Hartley Act was signed into law the next year. This assault on food and tobacco workers by the CIO followed the collapse of the CIO's Operation Dixie in 1946, which had been touted as a campaign to organize the South on a non-racial basis. Operation Dixie's CIO director, Van Bittner, refused to allow radical unions like the FTA to take part, despite they were the ones that were having great success in organizing in the Jim Crow South. Instead, the campaign focused on white workers who worked in the racially segregated textile industry. Their union, the old AFL Textile Workers, now under the CIO, the Textile Workers Organizing Committee, had been routed in the massive textile workers' general strike of 1934, when a rank-and-file prairie fire of 400,000 workers from Maine to South Carolina defied their AFL leadership, organizing mill after mill. The biggest strike in U.S. history would only be put down by the U.S. Army machine guns and the murder of 10 strikers. But to continue with this history, by 1936, John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers had successfully challenged the racist, craft-oriented AFL and launched a historic campaign in basic industry, organizing Black and white workers and women together as never before on an inclusive industrial basis with the full cooperation of the National Negro Congress. We could do a whole program on the National Negro Congress, but we can't now. In 1937, Lewis had given a CIO charter to the Communist Cannery Workers Union, Yucca United Cannery Workers, soon to be renamed the Food and Tobacco CIO. In 1941, the union sent Black organizer Owen Whitfield into North Carolina to begin organizing the 10,000 workers, most of whom were Black, and 60% Black and 40% white, who worked at R.J. Reynolds Tobacco in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Moranda Smith was one of those workers, toiling as a slave by another name, as a stemmer, tearing tobacco leaves off their stalks with her bare hands all day. She was in her early 20s and destined for a meteoric rise from the factory floor to national leadership in the labor movement in just a few short years. Smith, Velma Hopkins, Robert Black, and Theodosia Smith were workers who became undisputed leaders of their union, Local 22 FTA, and which had an international communist program an intentional communist program of advancing into leadership women of color and other Black workers, a practice begun in the beet fields and canneries of California among migrant Filipino, Japanese, and Mexican workers. Some, like Moranda Smith, Velma Hopkins, and Joe Black, joined the Communist Party because of its fierce anti-racist reputation and all-out struggles to defend Black workers like Angelo Herndon and the Scottsboro Nine. Moranda Smith would soon become the fiercest and bravest Black communist labor leader of them all. After first becoming the educational director of the union in 1949, she became in 1949 the FTA's Southern Regional Director. She led voter drives that registered thousands of first-time Black voters and elected Willie Greer, a Black alderman in Winston-Salem in 1946, the first African-American since Reconstruction to be elected to such a position. Her co-workers referred to her as, quote, aggressive and, quote, militant, someone who would never back down from a fight. Ed McCrae, who was a former communist organizer of the Union in 1943 and a friend of mine, knew her to be a same-gender loving woman, although she never publicly defined herself in terms of her sexual orientation. I mean, in the Jim Crow South in 1947, I don't think so. At first, White Reynolds Company negotiators would refuse to even speak to her during contract talks. Soon her co-workers would instruct these white men to, quote, address your remarks to Sister Smith, unquote, during negotiations. But by 1950, then food and tobacco workers and 9 other CIO unions were expelled from the CIO at the height of the national state-sponsored purge of communists and progressives from organized labor. Nevertheless, the FTA remained an organized force, and Moranda Smith never stopped organizing her rank and file until her untimely death at the age of 34 in April of 1950, just after that brave walk down Main Street of Apopka, Florida, that we talked about at the beginning. She had known her health was in jeopardy. Friends had urged her to give up her 2-pack-a-day smoking habit, but to no avail. The great Paul Robeson, just mentioned by Bryan, sang at her funeral in Winston-Salem, attended by an overflow crowd of 5,000 people. Her accomplishments stand today as a beacon to all workers and revolutionaries to be unafraid to fight racism as a class. That's a few words about Moranda Smith. If you're interested in finding out more about her, I would refer you to Robert Corsad's book, Civil Rights Unionism. You could go online to The Black Past. They have a piece on her. Or if you have access to a major library, you can look up Red Feminism, American Communism, and the Making of the Women's Liberation Movement by Kate Wigan. And you can, so those are just a few of the sources, but I am so happy to have the opportunity to trumpet a story about Moranda Smith, because she is my heroine in the labor movement and a guiding force for me and for other workers who know anything about her. So I guess we've come near the end of our special Black Labor History presentation. Unless my comrades here want to add a few more words at the end.
Yeah, no, just saying thank you to our listeners for listening, hearing us share some of the most inspiring moments of labor history that we could find for ourselves. And we're going to leave you off now with a little snippet from Finally Got the News, followed by a song by Paul Robeson. So have a good night, everyone. Thank you for listening in, and we will be back next week. Take care, solidarity, and love.
There's a cat who will stand up and say to you, he's in mining. And he sits in an office, man, on the 199th floor in some motherfucking building on Wall Street, and he's in mining. And he has papers, certificates, which are embroidered and shit, you know, stocks, bonds, debentures, obligations, you know. He's in mining. And he's sitting up in Wall Street, and his fingernails ain't been dirty in his motherfucking life. He went to Phillips Andover or Exeter. He went to Harvard. He went to Yale. He went to the Wharton School of Business, and he's in mining. And the motherfuckers who deal with intangibles are the motherfuckers who are rewarded in this society. The more abstract and intangible your shit is. Hey, stocks. What is stocks? A stock certificate is evidence of ownership in something that's real. Ownership. He owns and controls and therefore receives, you know, the benefit from. That's what they call profit. He fucking with shit in Bolivia. He fucking with shit in Chile. He's Kennecott. He's Anaconda. He's United Fruit. He's in mining. He's in what? He ain't never in his life produced shit. Investment bankers, stockbrokers, insurance men. It's motherfuckers who don't do nothing.
And before he went away, of course, they asked him to sing.
I dreamed I saw Joe here last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joel, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. In Salt Lake City, Joe says I am standing by my bed. They framed you on a murder charge, says Joe, but I ain't dead. Says Joe, but I ain't dead. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, says Joe, what they can never kill went on to organize, went on to organize. I dreamed I saw Joe here last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. I